Okay, welcome everyone to the AERA Science Teaching and Learning book chat. My name is Doug Larkin. I'm the program chair for the AERA Science Teaching and Learning Special Interest Group. And I am delighted to be here with Dr. Amanda McCrory and Dr. Michael Reiss to discuss the book, The Place of Ethics in Science Education. I'm going to share the screen just for a second to just show that, I have the book here, but just to set up what's coming down the pike here. So let's see. Okay, so here's our book for tonight, The Place of Ethics in Science Education. And just to give a quick announcement for our upcoming talks. Next month, we have Aaron Furtak, who is going to talk about formative assessment for 3D science learning. Then in December, Mark Winchittle is going to talk about his book, Teaching Climate Change. And John Rudolph will be talking about why we teach science. And then we actually have our February and March ones lined up, but we don't have the date set yet, so I'm not going to link those out. We will go ahead and we've been asked to put the registration links on the AERA page. So if people want to register for them in advance, they should be able to. Give us about a week and we'll have all of those up. So I can stop my share. So it's my pleasure to introduce. I'm going to read just a quick bio here. So Amanda McCrory is an associate professor of primary and science education at the Institute for Education at UCL, and where she's also the lead for the Science Special Interest Research Group and a member of the UCL Institute of Education Ethics Review Team. And Dr. Michael Reiss is a professor of science education, also at the Institute of Education at UCL, the University College London. And he is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, a member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and president of the Association for Science Education and of the International Society for Science and Religion. So welcome to you both. I'm delighted that you could both join us tonight, and I'm very excited to talk with you about this book.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.
So the first question is always a little bit of a softball, but we'll get started. So I'd like to ask the two of you to just give a brief overview of the book.
So Amanda is going to take that one on, I hope.
Well, really, the book is thinking about the place of ethics in science education, but really from early years, so from very young children, 4 or 5 year olds, through primary school. So for us, that's up to about the age of 11, and then through to secondary. And we do also think through or talk through some case studies slightly after that, so at undergraduate level.
Okay. Thanks. Well, I think that the question behind that question is, so there's a lot of things that people can write books about. Why this topic? And you know, I read the whole book. I'm very excited to talk with you about some of the different parts of it. So, but I do want to start broad. So what's behind the you know, there's all sorts of things we can write about in science education. Why ethics?
So shall I start on that one?
Yeah. Feel free, Michael.
So we've known each other for about 20 years professionally, and genuinely, each of us independently was interested in ethics in science education before we met. So it's been one of those things that we've talked about a great deal over the years. I don't think we've, remarkably, before this book, actually ever written anything together.
Mm.
So I think Amanda can take some of the credit for prodding me into the two of us doing this together, because I now can't remember whether it was her saying she was thinking of writing it or me saying I thought she ought to write something on this. But anyway, once we decided we'd have a go together, it all flowed fairly quickly.
Mm. Yeah, and you know, I mean, I'm sure for Michael as well, but for myself, being an ex-teacher, well, I still see myself as a teacher, to be honest, at heart. I think perhaps we all do, once we've been a teacher. It really was looking at, you know, talking to my student teachers, talking to my friends who are still teaching in school, listening to you know, what teachers are saying about what children are interested in, but also how to deal with controversial issues in science and how to, you know, discuss ethics in science with younger children, which is really, you know, behind why we wanted to write this book, because to our knowledge, there isn't really any other book out there that looks at ethics in science education across primary and secondary. So that was also at the forefront, because, you know, for me, one of the things that I would like to see more is of a coming together of practitioners in primary and secondary. And so we wanted to really write about how, you know, it's that all teachers can do this, and that actually the skills and the knowledge behind it, yes, of course, are important, but, you know, that primary and secondary school teachers have much more in common than perhaps is sometimes, you know, talked about.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that struck me right off the bat was the argument that you made about, and forgive me if this isn't the right term to apply, but, you know, we have this area of study in science ed where the focus is on learning progressions. And I think the argument that you both make at the end of chapter 4 is that, you know, just like there are learning progressions for science, there are learning progressions for ethics. And I think those two have been sort of well understood each on their own, but you're making a link here between the two of them. And I wonder if we could just sort of unpack that a little bit as to how you see, where does that analogy hold, and where does it not hold?
So I think the analogy holds quite tightly. The research base on progression in ethical reasoning is not as extensive as it is in conceptual reasoning within science. But Piaget, going back to Gerald Piaget, of course, did quite a lot about children's moral reasoning at what he described as different stages. We probably, most of us now, use a slightly different language. And I remember doing one project in New Zealand about 15 years ago and having a real go at deciding for a load of rather specific issues what might one want in progression at different stages, because I got rather frustrated with the fact that even at our national examinations for 16-year-olds, you seem to be able to get full marks for anything to do with ethics in science if you could just give one possible advantage of a piece of scientific technological development and one possible disadvantage. And when I looked at awarding boards, which is the name we give for the people who set the exam, when I look at what they expected in subjects like history and religious education and philosophy, they expected a far more nuanced understanding of ethics from 16-year-olds. And we in science seemed often to be content what actually any reasonably bright 10-year-old would come up with without a great deal of teaching.
So is the argument then that if our expectations are low for ethical reasoning, the expectations are low because we're not actually teaching ethical reasoning? Is that the connect? I mean, in a way, that's part of the main argument of the book, but I wonder if it's as explicit as that.
Yes. Yes, I think it is. I think it is. I think, you know, to look at it from a primary perspective, where certainly in England, you know, we had an assessment at the end of year 6. You know, in primary schools in England, there is an obsession, and I would use the word obsession, with SATs at the end of year 6 for English and maths, and that doesn't exist anymore for science. Prior to that, when we're thinking about progression, you know, in primary, there was very much a benchmark in every year group. You know, children are either working towards, or they're working at a particular level, or they're working further than a particular level. But actually considering and thinking ethically isn't a tick box exercise. It isn't something that's very easily benchmarked. It isn't something that's very easy to assess. And there hasn't, I mean, there hasn't been very much research at all in how to assess ethical thinking in science in primary. And Michael, has there been much more in secondary? I don't think there has been a lot, has there? No. So this kind of idea of progression, I think we have to take a bit of a step back from, because, you know, progression isn't linear in any state or form. So for us, when we're thinking about this ethical thinking in science, we're actually, it is complex, because when we're thinking about assessment, because really nothing much exists at the moment apart from what Michael has already described. And, you know, there's really not much more in primary.
Can I give a concrete example, Doug?
Yes.
Just in case there's anyone out there who hasn't already read the book. If we think of something like teaching in high school, particulate theory of matter, we might want to start off when children are nice and young, 5 or 6, just by getting them to look at puddles in a school playground on a day that's quite damp in the morning and sunny in the afternoon, and noticing that the puddles get smaller. And then later in primary school, we might want to introduce them to terms like evaporation. We might contrast this with condensation. And then in lower secondary school, we begin to get them to think about different phases of matter, and water, of course, going from being a liquid to being a gas in evaporation into water vapor. And then eventually, depending on what age they get to and how far they study, at the top of high school in England, you might be getting onto latent heats of evaporation and things like that. Now, very little ethics in science teaching ever has that notion of intellectual development. But if one thinks of something like whether or not genetic engineering of crops is a good idea, we might want people at different stages to start realizing when they're quite young, well, we need to look at whether or not claims that genetic engineering of crops will create super weeds are valid or not. And that's in fact an extrinsic ethical consideration. It's an instrumental way of viewing a worry. As they get older, we wouldn't want them to forget about those sorts of arguments, but we might want them to consider intrinsic arguments. So on the one hand, there are people who argue intrinsically it's not right to interfere with nature. That's a very common argument, as we know, among many adults, let alone teenagers. And we wouldn't dismiss that, but we want them to follow that through to some logical conclusions. Does that mean that medical interventions are ethically wrong because we're interfering with the natural course of a disease, et cetera, et cetera? So we'd like the book to be helpful for teachers and also for people working in informal learning settings like museums or zoos. We'd like it to be helpful for them in just thinking of their audiences in informal settings, their students in a classroom, and making sure that their students really feel, wow, there's a proper planned course here that I'm going to not just be repeating the same thing year after year.
Thank you. So as you know, in ethics, we run out of the simple questions really fast. So I have a whole bunch of other ones that we can get to. But I want to make sure that those folks who are attending on the Zoom know that we want to welcome your questions. So you can either, as we're talking here, you can put them in the chat, or if you want to use the hand raising function of Zoom. If you actually raise your hand, I might not see you because I have the speaker right on my screen. But if you can put something into the chat, or just do the hand, I think happy face icon does it. Okay, Dima, you're up. Thanks for stepping up right from the start. The floor is yours. We need you to turn on your microphone. Oh, I need to unmute you. I'm sorry, I did a thing.
Yeah, it's done now, I think.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I haven't read the book. It's because when Amanda and Michael had the launch, I was at a conference, so I really I'm at a disadvantage. However, what came to my mind is the timing for this just because there is a gap, or is it because also we've seen so many latest developments, both in terms of technology, like, Michael just gave an example of genetically modified crops, but things like vaccines and COVID, things to do with sex education in England, where sort of recent changes in the curriculum have taken place, and more demand on teachers. So what was it really that drove these kind of questions? That's number one. And number two, when Michael explained the kind of processes that happen in the progression, it seemed to me it wasn't just ethical. There was a lot of criticality going on as well.
Do you want to start, Amanda, or not?
Yes, happy to. Well, as an academic, I could say to you, there was a gap in the literature, and that's a responsibility as an academic to fulfill that gap. I could say that to you. I could also do the whole ref argument and all of the rest of it, but actually that's certainly not what drives me, and I know that's not what drives Michael either. So absolutely, it's a response to what's going on the ground, I would say. What we're seeing and hearing, across our networks, not just in the classroom, but also, across things like the Science SIG, across the kind of papers that we share, the groups that we're in. So that was, the impetus, I suppose, to bring that together. And then, sorry, Dima, second point. Sorry,
yeah, the second was about criticality, and so yeah. It's not just about ethics, really, it's about critical thinking as well.
And I think what we're not saying is that the ethical thinking stands alone. Alongside that, of course, there's that criticality, but there's also scientific thinking. There's also assessment in relation to scientific knowledge and understanding. So we're saying that it's integral to. We're not saying that promoting ethical thinking is actually for every single aspect of science education either. And we're also, very clear to say that, you have to take children's development into account, where they are in their learning, for example, but certainly we don't see it as something that's separate to.
I'll respond as well. I ought Doug to sort of, admit that actually Amanda and I do know Dima. In fact, Dima is a colleague, and Dima and I actually share an office, although at the moment, to describe it as an office is a rather generous description. We've been in it for 10 weeks and there is no shelving, no table, and we had to borrow chairs, but we have hopes that these things are going to arrive soon. Dima, I ought to give you a copy of the book fairly obviously, because there's a pile of about 3 of them. You don't have to buy one. But I think your first point is a really good one, because I've been in science education, a lot longer than you and Amanda have. And when I first started writing academically, I think I was definitely perceived in writing about issues to do with ethics or religion, or even, to be honest, issues to do with race and ethnicity in science, as being good stuff, but very much on the peripheral. The heart of science education was much more about misconceptions, progression, as Doug mentioned, things like that. And one of the things I found rather interestingly, I think the last 10 or 15 years in the US, as well as in the UK, is that there isn't quite such a hierarchical model within science education now. Many people are interested in all of these areas, and therefore, in a sense, the time has come for topics like ethics in science education to be taken seriously. On the point about criticality, I think you're absolutely right. And Amanda took the lead on the 2 chapters in the book that are on argumentation and socio-scientific issues. And both of those, of course, are about much more than just ethics in science. Ethics is core to socio-scientific issues and plays a role in much of argumentation, but there's a wider set of things we're trying to develop among our students. And one of my bugbears is meeting so many adults who tell me that they didn't enjoy their science at school, and they were given opportunities in other subjects like history or whatever first language it was, to discuss, to engage, to bring their own ideas, to be expected by their teachers often to be able to reason to a high standard. And they didn't feel that was the case in science, even if they quite enjoyed them and did fairly well in it. And I think probably, as you say, criticality, role of ethics and so on can give a much more rounded science education.
Thank you both.
Thank you for your questions, Dima. And again, I want to encourage anybody in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question. Xavier.
Good afternoon and good evening, and thank you so much. And no, I haven't read the book yet, but Michael, I'm reading your new book, The New Biology. So I'm
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What a wonderful person.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for tending to this topic. One of the I actually have a student who's interested in ethical and moral reasoning in science education, a graduate student, and we're actually struggling to find literature to support us, and we have to go outside of science, as you mentioned. Is your book, in your book, do you tackle with the differences, educational differences, when addressing moral reasoning versus ethical reasoning, and particularly in elementary contexts? Because my grad student is actually, unfortunately, couldn't attend, but is interested in that.
Do you want to try, Amanda, or do you want me to?
Take the lead, Michael, on this one, I think.
So I don't know you personally, so I don't know your background. When I was trained in moral philosophy, none of us, to be honest, paid much attention to the difference between morality and ethics. And then I found, this is 25 years ago, when I gave lots of talks, public talks often, one of the first questions I'd often be asked was the difference between morals and ethics. So after a bit, I trotted out one of the standard accounts, which I'm sure you'll know, which is something about, and Amanda and I discuss this in the book, all of us have moral viewpoints, which are worthy of taking seriously, but they are underpinned by some sort of ethical framework, which has a degree of internal consistency and ought to result to particular frames of reasoning. That's okay as a definition, but in England, now, the terms are often not hugely distinguished, and I certainly can't point you to good literature, especially at elementary level. And I don't know if you can, Amanda, because you're the primary specialist more than me, but on the differences between moral reasoning and ethical reasoning. Yeah.
And I think the point we make in the book is that they are very interchangeable. And that, the language is used in that way, especially at primary. So therefore, I think when I was a doctoral student, that was something I grappled with quite a lot, because, when you're learning to write at doctoral level and you're thinking about all of these, all of this terminology, and you've got to be so clear. I remember for ages thinking about the difference between thinking and reasoning, and trying to be clear on that. I think when you're teaching, yes, of course you want to be clear with the children, but I think it's the definition that's important. And I think it's, for a teacher, it's about what you're looking for in relation to what the children are saying and how you can scaffold that or not. That's important. So in terms of literature that, talks about the differences between the two, I can't highlight any to you apart from the book that we've just written, where we just say it's interchangeable. The Journal of Moral Education is a great journal in terms of looking at moral reasoning, but I can't think of anything that I've read maybe in the last 10 years that is really, really gives a thorough difference between the two. So sorry not to be helpful on that one, Xavier.
Get your grad student to email me if your grad student wants to, quite have to have an email conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So I've actually got a follow-up from that. So I think, we can debate the distinction between ethics and moral, but to me ethics and morals, but to me, the more interesting distinction was that epistemological difference between science and ethics. That, again, that was an argument that I had not encountered before, and I found compelling. And so that, and you know, you're reading something, you know, you're deep in it when you're reading David Hume at 2 o'clock on Sunday, right? But but the after the Hume quote, you have this other quote that says, "We cannot reason from how things are (parentheses the scope of science) to how they should be (parentheses the scope of ethics." And that really got me thinking. My grandfather was an engineer, and thinking about where engineering fits. Engineering fits squarely within science. In we had called them the science and engineering standards and science and engineering practices in the U.S. And I think about engineering as fitting more into that how things ought to be, right? So this air conditioning unit ought to cool this room by 5 degrees centigrade on a hot day, that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering if it's a definitional issue, are those parentheses around science right? Like, is part of science the scope of what ought to be, since science is a human activity?
So let me start on this. First of all, David Hume sends his apologies, couldn't be here with us this evening, unfortunately. In England, we place engineering more at school level and college level at what we call design and technology. And of course, you know this better than I do by your family, Doug, of course, good engineering rests on good science. You design a bridge if you don't know enough about forces, Young's modulus, elasticity, etc. It's at worst, it's going to kill people, and at best, it's going to be a very expensive bridge because you're going to overbuild it. But of course, engineering has a values component. It has a values component in terms of aesthetics. We like beautiful bridges. Bridges can be beautiful, of course, but it also, as you point out, has a values component because engineering is much more closely connected to the human condition than are most of the natural sciences. Now, I'm a biologist, so I'm very comfortable about the idea, for example, that a good design for a nature reserve or for fishing includes human and other values. But a lot of the bread and butter science teaching that we want to teach in school does sit pretty distinct from issues of ethics and morality. And certainly for young students, I find there's value in that clarity. And just to give another example, mathematics has an epistemology, which certainly for school level students is wholly, W-H-O-L-Y, wholly distinct from epistemology in either science or moral philosophy. One of the almost a sort of jokes I often tell is that mathematicians do not establish that the sum of the internal angles of a flat triangle is 180 degrees by going out into the field, gathering samples of triangles, bringing them back to the lab, growing them on good quality petri dishes, carefully measuring them, getting the average, etc., etc. It's a joke because the idea is absurd. That's not how mathematicians establish truth. And similarly, the way that we try and establish truth in science and in moral philosophy is pretty distinct.
Yeah.
I can't resist saying in England, we quite often get debates with wonderful top atheists who are usually very, very good at science and see scientific ways of reasoning as being the only valid ones.
Yeah.
And by the time you very gently pointed out, I've done this in public debates, very gently pointed out that actually mathematical reasoning is different, reasoning in moral philosophy is different, reasoning in aesthetics is different, you don't even have to get on to whether or not there's any worth in religious reasoning, because by then the point has usually been quite well made that there are a number of domains of knowledge and they're not entirely overlapping.
Right. Well, I think there's that applied nature and the different values, if we're talking about human values for engineering, but then there's also the arguments over those values, right? Like that's a different thing together. I think of that movie, The Jurassic Park, where the chaotician says, we worried more that we could rather than we should, right? Or something along. But it seems that an ethical framework would be well poised to at least begin addressing conversations within that domain.
Absolutely agree. Can I give another very simple example? And I'll let
Please, and then we'll go to Dima.
Yeah. So very simple example. Almost all schools in England at some point teach about energy in physics, and they teach about it in a very physics-related way at first, making distinctions about energy, power, force, and so on. But they end up nearly always having a section on energy supply for the United Kingdom. And then at standard level, you get children nowadays to think about the advantages and disadvantages of different, they're usually called at school level sources of energy, though some of my physics colleagues get very unhappy with that sort of language. But then I've learned that physicists seem to get very unhappy in school with most language. But you talk about the advantage of renewables, but you can't do everything with renewables. And as you and I know, that's an example of human values. What do we mean by a good energy source? And that's not often in England so discussed. It's sort of implicit, and it's worth being explicit. Are we talking about affordability? Are we talking about sustainability? Are we talking about making sure there's never a time when the country doesn't have the energy supply it needs? Are we talking about the safety of the people who work to generate the energy? They're all important considerations, and they don't give identical predictions about what we should rely on for our energy.
Thank you. Dima, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, listening to those arguments about the different ethical stances in different disciplines and how they can be seen epistemologically. I come from an interest in critical realism, which is a philosophy of science, and the philosopher behind it always said his project was normative, and therefore, listening to those discussions, I'm wondering whether Amanda and Michael have sort of answered the question in their book, whether it's desirable to have ethical discussions in science, or whether it's necessary, or whether science education, the whole endeavor, both teaching and learning, is a normative project, really, because it is about the interaction of people with society and the universe. And
yeah, well, Dima, we absolutely argue that it's necessary, that it's not necessary perhaps across, as I said earlier, every single aspect of science education, excuse me, but we feel that it's absolutely necessary to enable children to learn to think ethically and consider ethics when they are thinking about science.
And I think your point about the normative dimension of science education follows on very well from what Doug was talking about, because although I can try, as I've done, and I won't repeat it, to make a clear-cut distinction on epistemological grounds between science and ethics, in reality, as we all know, and as Doug was explaining in terms of engineering, the way that science is used immediately introduces a normative dimension. And also, which we haven't yet talked about, most students, in my experience, are more motivated once the science that they have learned is put in some sort of context about why is this relevant? How are we going to use it? It's not true for 100% of the students. And in fact, I don't think I was in that group when I was a teenager. I just loved learning the pure physics and the pure chemistry. Certainly, that's all I can remember now, though I suspect my teachers must have included around that rather more. But AI was in a minority. and B, teaching is all about trying to keep as many people in the class on board and motivated as possible. And often, actually, one of the great things about ethics is you can just do a little few minutes at the beginning or the end of a class, sometimes linking it to something quite topical in the news, that gets students thinking and helps them appreciate the links.
Yeah, and I also think, if you take a child-centered approach to your teaching, in my experience, it's often children who have approached me with their questions. Oh, I was watching Star Wars. How do you make a clone? Oh, see BBC News Round last night. Oh, there were fish that glow in the dark. How does that work? And then, when I first started teaching, I think probably I picked up on the scientific questions first. But that was probably because I came from a science background, and I probably wasn't as attuned to the ethical questions that the children were asking. But then I started to see children ask questions about what's right, what's wrong, what's fair, what's honest. I started to see that language seep into science lessons. Of course, in primary, it is different because, children have the same teacher all of the time. So you may teach a science lesson on Monday, and then suddenly you come in on Wednesday morning and a child will ask you something that they've gone off and thought about and come back and, and they want an answer to, or and I think it's a very different way of teaching, because yes, you are the expert, and I say it like this, but you have to have some humility. You have to be able to say to your students, gosh, I don't know, I've no idea. Where has that come from? Let's find that out together. That's a very different pedagogy, isn't it? Certainly from one that I experienced as a school teacher. And my experience was very different to Michael's, because for me, yes, I enjoyed learning the science, but I also had a mother at home who would probe me with ethical questions when I went home and said, this is what I've been doing. And then she would ask me particular questions, and then that would go off and make me think. So for me, that kind of ethical aspect of it was I suppose, ingrained from an early age. And that's what I found interesting at school. Didn't do much of it at school. And as a science educator, would like to see that change.
So Amanda, that's a perfect opening for this next question, and it's a simple one. Can we talk about puppets some more?
You can, of course.
Because you're talking about this pedagogy, and having read the book, I'm imagining all this happening with like little. Can you just talk about where that part of the book comes from and how you see it connecting to this larger effort?
Yeah, I mean, I first became, every primary school teacher at some point will use puppets. Even if you work with older children, there'll be a time where you'll be sent off to work with younger children. There's that mixture that goes on. So puppets will come into play, and actually they're used very differently with very young children, 3 to 5 year olds, as they are to 10 to 11 year olds. So, with a 10 to 11 year old, for example, I might use a puppet. That puppet might be the expert, or that puppet may be the person who actually doesn't quite understand and needs the children to help scaffold their understanding. So in terms of academia, I became involved in it. As a teacher, I was part of the Puppets project, which was, it was a long time ago now, probably 20 years ago now. I can't remember the exact time, but that's when I started to use puppets to teach science. And that was with 6 to 7 year olds. So that was when I taught very young children. And puppets, what do puppets do? Well, they enable children to have a different voice. They enable children to make mistakes. They enable children to have agency and to use those puppets in any way that they want to. Now, you may start as a teacher by modeling that. As I said, I used to use them as, the puppet was the expert, or, the puppet didn't understand. But then gradually what happens is children just take over. And then they find their own voice through the puppets. And people used to say to me, oh, you'll never be able to use puppets with year 6 children. They'll just eat you alive. They'll absolutely eat you alive. And you'll just be so surprised. One point about puppets, though, when I first started teaching, they weren't very diverse. You know, they were very white. They were very male. Now there is such a diversity of puppets. I'm going to say human puppets, but you can also do this with non-human puppets. You know, so different animals, plants, etc., etc. So it's a pedagogy that actually enables a teacher to listen. You need time to listen to what children are saying and how they're playing. When they're very young, it may be that you're looking at non-verbal cues. You're looking at how the children are moving the puppets or what the children are saying with the puppets. That progresses as depending on what you want to do with the puppets. So, if anybody wants to do anything after this lecture, go out, get yourself a puppet and see how you can use one in the classroom.
Thank you. I may just do that. Every time I was at a museum the other day and I had one in my hand, I was like, and now when I'm back there, I'm going to get one. I'm going to shell out the $30 for the lemur or whatever it is.
Yeah. And when I first started teaching, I had very generous people who would knit me puppets. I wouldn't buy them, but people would just knit them for me. So which was great.
Well, I imagine it does something also. There's an identity piece to that too, right? That you can in the same way that kids do avatars on video games, you inhabit somebody else and you can be that other person for just it. You can maybe argue something that you yourself don't believe, but you want to take the argument for a test drive.
Right. And I think for a well-established pedagogy in primary teaching is using storybooks. And now, if you go into any bookshop, library, the amount of storybooks that are appropriate for children and, which have a science element to them. I mean, there's a huge amount that you can use. And often they come with puppets. So, or you get the children to make the puppets.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask one more question, but also if there's somebody in the audience, we have about maybe 10, 15 minutes left. So we'll, I think where I want to sort of land with this conversation is the specific example given at the end of the book. And I was really struck by that story about the search for Osama bin Laden and the sort of fake CIA operation with the Hep B vaccine that they were actually using to take. I hadn't known that story. I probably should have, but I didn't. And I think that's a pretty powerful example because it illustrates like many facets of the argument that you make throughout the book. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that episode and what you think the takeaway message is, both for the teaching of science content and if we are able to scaffold ethics education up to sort of an analogous level where the science is, what the takeaway message for teachers might be in engaging with that story and teaching that content.
Yeah, I'll probably start on that one. So, because most of you won't know this story at all, I only found out about it about 3 years ago. So the sort of historical background, very briefly, is that when in the US, the CIA were trying to find precisely where Osama bin Laden was after the 9/11 atrocities, they realized he was almost certainly in a particular area of Pakistan. But being honest, they weren't really getting any help from the Pakistan security services. So they hit on the idea of getting hold of blood samples from lots of children and using DNA testing to find which of them were Osama bin Laden's relatives, because by coincidence, one of his close relatives lived in the States and they had her blood sample. The next thing is, how do you persuade people to give you blood samples? And I'm afraid what was done was a fake vaccination program was launched. And it wasn't, therefore, a helpful external agency undertaking vaccination. It was basically CIA operatives collecting blood samples. As usually happens eventually, this gets out. Not very surprisingly, it led to two things. It led to a collapse in the number of people, not only in that area of Pakistan, but over a much larger area, being willing to have their children vaccinated. It also led in the short term to quite a lot of health workers being killed. And in the long term, it led to a lot more children dying. The reason we went into that example is because certainly in the UK, and I think in many other countries, vaccines are presented unproblematically as a good in school science textbooks. And therefore, if the message seems to be, if you as a parent don't agree to get your children vaccinated, you're either stupid or you're selfish. You're relying on herd immunity, you're relying on everybody else getting their children vaccinated. So this was just one example of why actually people can have quite valid hesitations about whether or not to get their children vaccinated. And then, Doug, your more general point, more general hesitation about a lot of other uses and applications of science.
Right. So how about as science educators who are interested in this question of ethics in science teaching and learning, what do we do with that case, right? Like what do we, let's say that we present that to students. What happens then? What kind of lesson might follow from sharing that case?
Okay. I don't know I'd necessarily present that particular historical case to all students, because it might even inflame a situation in a classroom and make things worse. It's more that I think for me, as a science educator, stories like that help me be more understanding of the diversity of reasons why somebody might not accept a particular current science understanding. As some of you will know, I've written about evolution education for many years. I'm an evolutionary biologist by background. I'm very comfortable with the theory of evolution, but I'm quite sensitive to people who come from families that do not accept the theory of evolution. And I've spent a lot of time suggesting ways that one might teach, which still involves teaching about evolution. I want everybody to learn about the theory of evolution, but for me, does not entail trying to persuade everybody to accept the theory of evolution. To repeat, I accept the theory of evolution. I'm very keen on getting vaccinated, but I don't see it as the job of a science educator to try and persuade everybody in the classroom that evolution, the theory of evolution, the Earth being, 4.5 billion years old, the universe being 13.8, all life originating from one or more common ancestors, etc. I don't see the teacher having to, as it were, persuade everybody in the class that they need to accept that. And I don't see them as I don't see teachers, science teachers, as needing every child to think, I must get vaccinated for every single disease where there's a possible vaccine.
So at the risk of pressing, and that's what we do in argumentation, I would say, well, isn't that imposing a human value over top of the science content that we want to teach them, right? Isn't that getting away from how things are from how they should be?
And as Amanda has so articulately put it, we're quite keen that good science education not only covers the science narrowly understood, but also helps people realize, I don't mind whether the metaphor is on top of or alongside or whatever, but realizes that, as you well know, there, at the very least, there are ethical implications in much of science. But the more science you learn, the more you know about vaccines, the better you will be positioned to decide, whether or not to accept what your political leaders might be telling you about vaccines, either being always good for you or always bad for you.
Yeah. And understanding the nature of science and the process of science and the ethical thinking that goes along with that is important. It's an important aspect of being knowledgeable about or being able to make those decisions. I think what we're saying is that ethical thinking is a component of it, but we're not teaching children how to think. What we're saying is important is enabling students to think critically, to think ethically, to progress in that thinking, but we're not telling them what to think or how to think. And that's really, really important because, as one of my students said to me last week, I'm learning to disagree well, Amanda. And I thought, good. So, it's the process that's important, rather than having, forcing children to say, this is right, this is wrong, this is black, this is white, this is X, this is Y. It's enabling them to think. Because once they leave school and they become citizens of the world, well, they're still citizens of the world when they're at school, but when they're making those decisions for themselves and they're, the argument of a flourishing life and being able to be scientifically literate. And John, who you have I've noticed, John, you'll be talking to John Rudolph. He came and talked to the Science SIG at UCL about his book, and he talked very much about, scientific literacy. If this is a desire for science education, then surely we need to enable our students to think, to think critically rather than just accept. And our students now look at the activism that's taking place across the world, look at the information they have at the touch of a button, look at how they can organize themselves, look at how they are interested in things that are happening across the world. We're rapidly, not only are we having, we've got all of these technological advances and that's happening, but we're changing the way that children learn. And that's only going to continue. So let's teach them to be critical. Let's teach them to think, and let's trust them.
Well, yeah, I think that argument holds for me if I think about ethics as a critical component of assessing credibility, right? As part of the nature of science, as you laid out. But I think that's part of the issue with disinformation, misinformation, right? How do I know that this person who is telling me this science fact is a credible source? And certainly if somebody's written a book written by a publisher that you've heard of, you can upgrade the credibility of that argument more. If it's a random source on an internet chat forum, maybe it lowers a little bit. But I think that thinking about has this person, whatever claim they're making, is the ethical component of that claim visible or made visible, or is it tucked away and we're just meant to accept that claim on its face without challenging what the ethical framework of that claim might lead to.
Yep.
All right. Last chance for any questions from the audience. Going once. I know we're right up at time here. So I want to take this moment to publicly thank Amanda and Michael for joining us today. We can give them all a round of applause. Thank you. It's different online than in person, but again, thank you so much. For those of you who joined the talk, we will make the recording accessible. We'll send a link out to the same sign up that you used to get here. Any last thoughts or anything you'd like to close with, Michael or Amanda?
Well, thanks to you, Doug, because it's Amanda runs our SIG. What you're doing is very analogous, but it's online and for an international audience. So a huge amount of work that's entailed. So thank you, Doug.
Yes, thanks, Doug. And Doug and I contacted each other on Twitter. So there we go. The joys of social media has meant that we can all connect. So thanks so much, Doug, for taking my tweet seriously.
So once again, the book is The Place of Ethics in Science Education, Implication for Practice. So thank you both for being here today. I'm going to stop the recording and we can chit chat a little bit, but Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Great to see everybody. Thanks ever so much.